Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you're from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the Carter household on Sycamore Lane, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that had seen 3 generations of family life. It was Tuesday, June 17th, 1996, and the small town of Maple Ridge, Oregon, was waking up to what everyone assumed would be another ordinary summer day. The Douglas firs that surrounded the town stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze that carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut grass from neighboring yards. Birds chirped their familiar songs, and the distant sound of a lawnmower starting up somewhere down the street provided the soundtrack to suburban tranquility. Inside the Carter home, Sarah Carter stood at the kitchen counter, methodically making her daughter's lunch just as she had done countless times before. The routine was so familiar, she could do it with her eyes closed. 2 slices of whole wheat bread, a thin layer of strawberry jam, peanut butter spread evenly on the other slice, crusts cut off because Lily insisted they tasted different than the rest of the bread. An apple sliced into quarters, a juice box, and 3 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in wax paper completed the meal. The brown paper bag with Lily's name written in blue marker sat waiting on the counter, ready to be grabbed on the way out the door. Upstairs, 7-year-old Lily Carter was brushing her teeth in the bathroom she shared with her older brother, Michael. She stood on her step stool, carefully moving the toothbrush back and forth, just like the dentist had shown her during their last visit. Her blonde hair, still tangled from sleep, hung past her shoulders, and she wore her favorite purple t-shirt with a unicorn on the front, paired with denim shorts that had a small grass stain on the left knee from playing at recess the previous week. Her pink backpack sat on her bed, already packed with the library book she needed to return, and the permission slip for the upcoming field trip to the Science Museum that her mother had signed the night before. The Carter household operated like clockwork most mornings. Thomas Carter, Lily's father, had already left for his job at the timber mill on the outskirts of town, his lunch pail packed, and his thermos filled with coffee strong enough to keep him alert through his shift that started at 6 in the morning. He had kissed both his children on the forehead before leaving, a ritual he never skipped, even on days when he was running late. Michael, who was 12 and believed himself too old for such displays of affection in front of his friends, tolerated it at home, where no one could see. Sarah called up the stairs that breakfast was ready, her voice carrying the particular tone that mothers develop after years of trying to be heard over the chaos of family life. Lily bounded down the stairs, her sneakers making loud thumping sounds that seemed too big for such a small person. She slid into her usual seat at the kitchen table, the one facing the window that looked out onto their backyard, where her swing set stood motionless in the morning stillness. A bowl of cereal with sliced bananas waited for her, and she dug in with the enthusiasm of a child who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious about showing enjoyment. Michael appeared moments later, his hair still wet from the shower, wearing the oversized basketball jersey that he insisted on wearing at least 3 times a week, despite his mother's protests that it needed washing. He grabbed a piece of toast and some orange juice, eating standing up because sitting down for breakfast felt too formal for someone who considered himself practically a teenager. He made a face at Lily when she stuck her tongue out at him, a morning tradition that their mother pretended not to notice, as she wiped down the counter and mentally ran through the list of errands she needed to complete before noon. The television in the living room played the local morning news at a low volume, barely audible over the sounds of breakfast and family chatter. The weatherman promised another beautiful day, with temperatures reaching the mid-70s, perfect for the kind of outdoor activities that made summers in Oregon feel magical to children who spent most of the school year confined to classrooms. The news anchor transitioned to a story about a town council meeting discussing new development near the interstate. But no one was really listening. These were the mundane details of small-town life that formed the background noise of existence in Maple Ridge. Sarah glanced at the clock above the stove and reminded Lily that the bus would be coming in 15 minutes. The bus stop was just 3 houses down, an easy walk that took less than 5 minutes even if you stopped to examine interesting rocks or chase a butterfly. In Maple Ridge, children walked to bus stops alone all the time. It was one of those things that defined the character of the community. This implicit trust that the neighborhood was safe, that everyone looked out for everyone else's children, that the worst thing that might happen was a scraped knee or a lost jacket. Lily finished her cereal, leaving a few banana slices floating in the milk, because she always saved them for last but inevitably forgot about them. She carried her bowl to the sink, standing on her tiptoes to place it on the counter because she couldn't quite reach to put it in the sink itself. Her mother smiled and ruffled her hair, earning a giggle and a half-hearted protest about messing up the ponytail that they had carefully constructed the night before to save time in the morning. The ritual of preparing for school continued with practiced efficiency. Lily grabbed her backpack from the bottom of the stairs where she had placed it the night before, following her mother's rule about always being ready the night before, so mornings wouldn't be rushed. She checked inside one more time to make sure everything was there, even though she had already checked twice after packing it. The library book about dolphins was there. The permission slip was tucked into the front pocket, and her pencil case with the glittery stickers was zipped securely closed. Sarah handed Lily her lunch bag and reminded her to eat everything, including the apple, and not to trade her cookies with Tommy Henderson again, because his mother had called to mention that Tommy had been coming home without his lunch and suspiciously full of cookies. Lily nodded solemnly, making a promise she probably wouldn't keep because Tommy was her best friend, and best friends shared cookies, no matter what their mothers said about balanced nutrition and sugar intake. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the neighborhood was fully awake now. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson was watering her flower beds, the spray from her hose creating tiny rainbows in the morning light. 2 houses down, Mr. Kowalski was loading his golf clubs into the trunk of his sedan, preparing for his weekly round at the municipal course. A jogger passed by on the sidewalk, headphones in place, lost in whatever music propelled them forward on their morning run. Everything was exactly as it should be in this quiet corner of Oregon where nothing ever happened, and everyone liked it that way. Michael had already left for his bus stop, which was in the opposite direction, and catered to the middle school students who had different schedules and different buses than the elementary school children. He had shouted goodbye without looking back, already thinking about the basketball game scheduled for lunch period, and whether Jennifer Morrison might actually talk to him today like his friend David had predicted she would. The screen door had slammed behind him, a sound so familiar that Sarah barely registered it anymore. Lily stood by the front door, her backpack straps adjusted on her shoulders, her lunch bag clutched in her right hand. She looked up at her mother with those bright blue eyes that everyone always commented on, eyes that matched her father's and her grandmother's before him. Sarah bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead, smoothing down a stray hair that refused to stay in the ponytail. She told Lily to have a good day at school, to listen to Mrs. Henderson, her teacher, and to remember that she was special and loved. These were the words Sarah said every morning, a benediction of sorts, a maternal blessing that she bestowed without thinking about it, never imagining a day when she wouldn't be able to say them. The front door opened, and Lily stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the Jacobsons' roses from the house next door and the smell of bacon from somewhere down the street where another family was having their breakfast. Lily turned and waved to her mother, who stood in the doorway watching her daughter walk down the 3 steps from the porch to the front walkway. Sarah waved back, already thinking about the laundry that needed to be started, and the grocery list she needed to write before heading to the store. The walkway from the Carter house to the sidewalk was made of old concrete, with cracks that had been there for years. Cracks that filled with weeds every summer, no matter how many times Thomas pulled them out. Lily knew every crack, every bump, every place where the concrete had lifted slightly from the freeze-thaw cycles of Pacific Northwest winters. She skipped along the walkway, her sneakers making soft, slapping sounds against the concrete, her ponytail bouncing with each step. At the sidewalk, Lily turned left, heading in the direction of the bus stop that was 3 houses down on the same side of the street. The morning sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the birds singing in the trees that lined Sycamore Lane. A squirrel darted across the road in front of her, its bushy tail twitching as it disappeared into the bushes in front of the Mercer's house. Lily watched it go, momentarily distracted by the way it moved, quick and jerky, like it couldn't decide which direction to run. The Jacobson house was first, with its perfectly manicured lawn and the flower beds that Mrs. Jacobson tended with the dedication of someone who found peace in working with the earth. The roses were in full bloom, their petals perfect and their colors vibrant. Lily could see Mrs. Jacobson in the window, washing dishes probably, or maybe cleaning up after her own breakfast. The older woman noticed Lily walking past and waved, a gesture that Lily returned with enthusiasm before continuing on her way. The second house belonged to the Mercers, a young couple who had moved to Maple Ridge just 2 years earlier. They both worked in the city, leaving early each morning and returning late each evening, so Lily didn't know them as well as she knew the other neighbors. Their house was painted a light blue that Thomas Carter had once commented looked like toothpaste, a remark that had made Lily giggle for days afterward. The Mercers' lawn was neat, but not as meticulously maintained as the Jacobsons', and there were toys scattered near the front porch from their toddler who was still too young for school. The third house was where old Mr. Brennan lived alone, ever since his wife had passed away 3 winters ago. His house needed painting, and the gutters were crooked in places, but Mr. Brennan was kind and always had hard candies in his pocket that he would offer to children who passed by his house. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the neighborhood go by, sometimes raising a hand in greeting, sometimes just sitting in silence with his memories. This morning, his porch was empty, and his newspaper still sat in its plastic sleeve at the end of his driveway, waiting to be retrieved. Just past Mr. Brennan's house was the bus stop, marked by a small yellow sign that read, "School Bus Stop," in bold black letters. It wasn't really a stop in the traditional sense, no bench or shelter, just a designated spot on the sidewalk where children gathered on weekday mornings to wait for the bus that would take them to Maple Ridge Elementary School. Usually there were 4 or 5 children at this stop, all from the surrounding houses, all familiar with each other from years of riding the same bus and attending the same school. This morning, however, the bus stop was empty. Lily was the first to arrive, which wasn't unusual because she was often early, a product of her mother's efficient morning routine, and Thomas Carter's belief that being on time meant being 5 minutes early. Lily set her lunch bag down on the ground and adjusted her backpack, looking up and down the street to see if any of the other children were coming. The bus wasn't due for another 5 minutes, so she wasn't worried. She knew that Tommy Henderson was always running late, arriving breathless and red-faced just as the bus was pulling up. The Morrison twins were usually on time, but not early, and Katie Sullivan sometimes walked with her older sister who attended the middle school and had already caught her bus. The street was quiet, unusually so for this time of morning. Normally there would be more activity, more cars pulling out of driveways, more people visible in windows or working in their yards. But this morning felt different somehow, though Lily couldn't have articulated why. It was as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something, though what that something might be remained undefined and unknown. A car passed by, a blue sedan that Lily didn't recognize, moving slowly down Sycamore Lane as if the driver was looking for an address. It slowed even more as it approached the bus stop, and Lily felt a small flutter of uncertainty in her stomach. Her parents had talked to her about stranger danger, about not getting into cars with people she didn't know, about screaming and running if anyone ever tried to grab her. But this car just drove past, continuing down the street before turning at the corner and disappearing from view. Lily relaxed, feeling silly for being nervous about nothing. Another minute passed, and still no other children appeared at the bus stop. Lily started humming a song she had learned in music class, something about a frog sitting on a log, and she swung her arms back and forth to create a rhythm. She was a child comfortable with her own company, capable of entertaining herself with nothing more than her imagination and whatever caught her attention. A dandelion growing through a crack in the sidewalk became an object of fascination, and she bent down to examine it closely, marveling at how something so delicate could push its way through concrete. The sound of an engine made her look up. But it wasn't the school bus. Instead, a pickup truck was approaching, rust-colored and older, moving even more slowly than the blue sedan had been. The truck's paint was faded and uneven, with spots where rust had eaten through the metal near the wheel wells. The windshield had a crack running across it that caught the morning sun and created a bright line of reflected light. The truck slowed as it approached the bus stop, and Lily straightened up, no longer interested in the dandelion. The truck came to a complete stop right in front of where Lily stood. The window was already rolled down, and the driver leaned slightly toward the passenger side to call out to her. He was a man Lily thought she might have seen before, though she couldn't be sure. He had a familiar quality about him, the kind of familiarity that comes from living in a small town where you've probably seen everyone at least once at the grocery store or the gas station or the post office. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low on his forehead, and his face was partially shadowed by the brim. The man called out, asking if she knew where Oak Street was, saying he was supposed to meet someone but had gotten turned around in the neighborhood. His voice was casual, friendly even, the kind of voice that didn't set off immediate alarm bells. Lily stepped closer to the truck, though she stayed on the sidewalk, maintaining the distance that felt safe. She pointed back the way the truck had come, explaining that Oak Street was 2 blocks over, and then left at the stop sign. Her voice was helpful, eager to assist, because that was how she had been raised, to be polite and helpful to people who asked questions. The man thanked her but said he was confused about the directions. He asked if she could show him on a map he had in the truck, and he gestured toward the passenger seat. Lily hesitated, that flutter of uncertainty returning to her stomach. She knew she wasn't supposed to get close to cars with strangers, but this didn't feel dangerous. The man wasn't asking her to get in, just to look at a map. And it was broad daylight, on her own street, with houses all around. What could possibly happen? She took a step closer to the truck, close enough now to see inside the cab. It was messy, with papers scattered on the dashboard and an empty coffee cup in the cup holder. The map the man had mentioned was spread across the passenger seat. Lily leaned forward slightly, trying to see the map better, trying to locate Oak Street so she could point it out more clearly. She was concentrating on the map, on being helpful, on doing the right thing by assisting someone who was lost. Everything happened in the space of seconds, so fast that Lily barely had time to register what was occurring. The passenger door swung open with sudden force, and the man reached out with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had appeared so casual just moments before. His hand closed around Lily's arm, and he pulled her toward the truck with a strength that lifted her feet off the ground. She dropped her lunch bag, and it landed on the sidewalk, the paper crinkling as the contents shifted inside. Lily tried to scream, but fear had closed her throat, and the sound that came out was barely more than a whimper. She pulled against the man's grip, her sneakers scrabbling for purchase on the sidewalk. But she was 7 years old, and weighed barely 50 pounds, and she was no match for an adult's strength. The man pulled her into the truck, and she fell across the passenger seat, her backpack making it awkward and difficult for her to move. Her head hit the dashboard, and stars exploded across her vision, momentarily disorienting her even further. The passenger door slammed shut, and the truck was already moving before the door had fully closed. Lily tried to sit up, tried to reach for the door handle, but the man's hand was on her shoulder, pushing her down, telling her to stay quiet, to not make this harder than it needed to be. His voice was no longer friendly, but had taken on a hard edge that frightened her more than anything else. She could hear her own breathing, fast and panicky, and she could smell the truck's interior, a mixture of old cigarette smoke and motor oil, and something else she couldn't identify. The truck accelerated, and Lily caught a glimpse of her street through the windshield, saw Mr. Brennan's house pass by, then the Mercers, then the Jacobsons. In the distance, she could see her own house, could see the front door that she had walked through just minutes earlier. The door was closed now, and there was no sign of her mother. No one had seen what happened. No one knew. The realization crashed over her with the weight of something final and terrifying. The truck turned at the corner, and Sycamore Lane disappeared from view. They were heading toward the edge of town, toward the industrial area where the businesses gave way to trees, where the roads became less traveled and the houses fewer and farther between. Lily was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs that she couldn't control. She wanted her mother. She wanted to be home. She wanted to undo the last 5 minutes and make different choices, to refuse to approach the truck, to run back to her house, to scream for help when she first felt that flutter of uncertainty. The man was talking, his words coming fast, telling her that everything would be okay, that he wasn't going to hurt her, that she just needed to be quiet and do what she was told. But his words didn't match his actions, didn't match the bruising grip he had on her shoulder or the speed at which he was driving. Lily didn't believe him. She knew with a child's instinct that something terrible was happening, that her life had changed in the space of seconds, that the morning that had started so normally had turned into something from the nightmares she sometimes had after watching scary movies at Tommy Henderson's house. Back on Sycamore Lane, the school bus was approaching. The driver, a woman named Margaret Reynolds who had been driving this route for 15 years, slowed as she approached the bus stop near Mr. Brennan's house. She could see that something was wrong immediately. There was a brown paper bag lying on the sidewalk, its contents spilled out, an apple that had rolled into the grass, a juice box crushed under what looked like it might have been a footprint. But there were no children waiting at the stop. Margaret put the bus in park and opened the door, stepping down onto the sidewalk to investigate. She picked up the paper bag and saw the name written in blue marker, Lily Carter. Margaret knew Lily, knew all the children on her route by name. Lily was one of the good ones, always polite, always ready on time, always saying thank you when she got off the bus in the afternoon. Margaret looked around, expecting to see Lily coming from one of the nearby houses, maybe having forgotten something and run back home to retrieve it. But the street was empty. A feeling of unease settled over Margaret, a feeling that came from years of experience and a mother's intuition that something wasn't right. She walked to the Carter house, the paper bag still in her hand, and knocked on the front door. It took a moment for Sarah Carter to answer, and when she did, Margaret could see the confusion on her face, the question forming even before she spoke it. Why was the bus driver at her door? Why did she have Lily's lunch bag? Margaret explained what she had found, and she watched as the confusion on Sarah's face transformed into concern, then into something closer to panic. Sarah called out for Lily, even though she knew her daughter wasn't in the house, even though she had watched her walk out the front door and down the sidewalk just 15 minutes earlier. Sarah ran down the front steps and up the sidewalk, Margaret following close behind, and together they stood at the bus stop, looking at the scattered lunch and the empty street. Sarah's voice was shaking as she asked Margaret what she thought had happened. Margaret didn't know what to say. In 15 years of driving a school bus, she had never encountered a situation like this. Children occasionally missed the bus, or sometimes they were sick and the parents forgot to call it in. But this felt different. The scattered lunch, the empty stop, the complete absence of any explanation. Margaret suggested they check with the neighbors. Maybe someone had seen something. Maybe there was a simple explanation that they weren't seeing yet. They knocked on Mr. Brennan's door first, but he was slow to answer. And when he finally did, he said he hadn't been outside yet this morning, hadn't seen anything unusual. Mrs. Jacobson came to her door more quickly, and she confirmed that she had seen Lily walk past her. Window had waved to her like she always did. But that had been maybe 15 minutes ago, and she hadn't looked out again after that. The Mercers weren't home, both already gone to work, their toddler at daycare in town. Sarah was fully panicking now, her breath coming in short gasps, her hands shaking as she pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed Thomas's number at the mill. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice distracted because he was in the middle of overseeing a lumber delivery. Sarah's words came out in a rush, barely coherent, something about Lily missing, and the bus stop, and the scattered lunch. Thomas tried to calm her down, tried to get her to explain more clearly, but as he listened, his own concern grew. He told her he was coming home immediately, told her to call the police, told her not to panic even though he was already feeling the first stirrings of real fear in his gut. Margaret Reynolds stood with Sarah on the sidewalk, uncertain whether she should continue her bus route or stay and help. She decided to stay, radioing dispatch to explain the situation and request that another driver be sent to cover her route. This was more important. A child was missing. Everything else could wait. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but her words were jumbled, her thoughts scattered. The operator, trained to deal with panicked callers, spoke in a calm, steady voice, asking Sarah to take a breath and start from the beginning. Sarah explained that her daughter had left for the bus stop 15 minutes ago and never made it onto the bus. The operator asked if Sarah had checked with friends and neighbors, and Sarah explained that she had, that no one had seen anything unusual except for Mrs. Jacobson, who had seen Lily walking past her house. The operator asked for a description of Lily. 7 years old, blonde hair in a ponytail, blue eyes, wearing a purple t-shirt with a unicorn and denim shorts, approximately 4 feet tall and 50 pounds. The operator asked if there were any family members or friends Lily might have gone to visit, anyone she might have left with willingly. Sarah said no. Lily knew to go straight to the bus stop, knew not to go anywhere else without permission. The operator promised that officers were being dispatched and should arrive within minutes, and she instructed Sarah to stay where she was and not to touch anything at the bus stop that might be evidence. Within 5 minutes, the first patrol car arrived, its lights flashing but the siren silent because there was no need to announce its presence to the entire neighborhood. 2 officers emerged from the car, both young men who looked barely older than teenagers themselves, though they carried themselves with the professional bearing that came from police training. Officer David Martinez approached Sarah while his partner, Officer James Thompson, began examining the bus stop area and the scattered lunch. Officer Martinez asked the same questions the 911 operator had asked, writing Sarah's answers in a small notebook he pulled from his breast pocket. He asked what time Lily had left the house, what route she would have taken to the bus stop, whether there had been any unusual activity in the neighborhood recently, whether there were any custody disputes or family conflicts that might be relevant. Sarah answered each question as thoroughly as she could, though her mind felt foggy, her thoughts difficult to organize into coherent sentences. Thomas Carter's pickup truck came speeding down Sycamore Lane, moving faster than the residential speed limit allowed. He barely put the truck in park before jumping out and running to where Sarah stood with Officer Martinez. He wrapped his arms around his wife, both of them drawing strength from the physical contact, both of them trying not to think about what Lily's disappearance might mean. Officer Martinez gave them a moment before continuing his questions, now directing some of them at Thomas, asking about whether Lily had mentioned anyone following her or making her uncomfortable, whether she had been acting differently lately, whether there was anything at all that might provide a clue to where she might have gone. More police cars arrived, and the quiet street suddenly became a center of activity. Officers began knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual this morning. They interviewed Mrs. Patterson across the street, who said she had been watering her flowers and had seen Lily walking toward the bus stop, but hadn't watched her the whole way because she had gone around to the side of her house to water the garden there. Mr. Kowalski, who had been loading his golf clubs, said he had been focused on his trunk and hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. The officer in charge of the scene, Sergeant Patricia Holloway, arrived in an unmarked car. She was a veteran of the Maple Ridge Police Department, a woman in her late 40s with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took control of the situation immediately, organizing the officers into teams, assigning some to canvass the neighborhood, while others began searching the surrounding area on foot. She spoke with Sarah and Thomas, asking them the same questions they had already answered multiple times, but doing so with a thoroughness that made it clear she was taking the situation seriously. The officer in charge of the scene, Sergeant Patricia Holloway, arrived in an unmarked car. She was a veteran of the Maple Ridge Police Department, a woman in her late 40s with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took control of the situation immediately, organizing the officers into teams, assigning some to canvass the neighborhood, while others began searching the surrounding area on foot. She spoke with Sarah and Thomas, asking them the same questions they had already answered multiple times, but doing so with a thoroughness that made it clear she was taking the situation seriously. Sergeant Holloway asked to see Lily's room, wanting to understand more about the missing girl, wanting to see if there was anything there that might provide a clue. Sarah led her upstairs to Lily's bedroom, a small room painted yellow with posters of unicorns and dolphins on the walls. Lily's bed was neatly made, her stuffed animals arranged in a precise row against the pillows. Her bookshelf was organized by size, and her clothes were put away in the dresser and closet. It was the room of a child who was well cared for, whose parents were attentive and present. Sergeant Holloway asked if she could look through Lily's belongings, and Sarah nodded, standing in the doorway watching as the sergeant carefully went through dresser drawers and looked under the bed. She examined the items on Lily's desk, flipping through notebooks and looking at drawings. There was nothing unusual, nothing that suggested Lily had been planning to run away or had been in contact with anyone concerning. It was exactly what Holloway had expected to find. The room of a normal 7-year-old girl living a normal life in a normal family. Back downstairs, the command center was being set up in the Carters' living room. Officers were arriving with equipment, setting up phones and radios, preparing to coordinate what was rapidly becoming a major search operation. The coffee table was cleared, and maps of Maple Ridge and the surrounding area were spread out, with officers using colored markers to divide the town into search grids. Sergeant Holloway explained to Sarah and Thomas that they were treating this as an abduction, that they were not waiting the traditional 24 hours before initiating a full search because Lily was a child, and because the circumstances suggested she had not left voluntarily. The news spread through Maple Ridge with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. Within an hour of the first 911 call, half the town knew that Lily Carter was missing. Parents who had sent their own children to school that morning felt a chill of fear, a sudden awareness of how fragile safety really was. The idea that a child could vanish in broad daylight, on a familiar street, just 3 houses from home, shattered the illusion of security that had defined life in Maple Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. By noon, volunteers were gathering at the Maple Ridge Community Center, which had been designated as the Volunteer Coordination Point. The center was a large brick building that normally hosted bake sales and town meetings and youth basketball games. But today, it was transforming into the headquarters of a massive search effort. People came from all over town and from neighboring communities as well, once the news reached them through local radio and television stations that were beginning to cover the story. The volunteers were organized into search teams, each team assigned to a specific area. Some would search the residential neighborhoods, walking through yards and checking behind sheds and in any place a child might hide or be hidden. Others were assigned to search the woods that surrounded Maple Ridge, dense stands of Douglas fir and cedar and hemlock that stretched for miles in every direction. The woods were beautiful, but also dangerous, with steep ravines and fast-moving streams and underbrush so thick it was easy to become disoriented and lost. State troopers arrived to assist with the search, bringing tracking dogs and specialized equipment. The dogs were German shepherds trained in search and rescue, and they began their work at the bus stop, sniffing the scattered lunch items and Lily's backpack, which had been found in the Mercer's front yard, apparently thrown or dropped there during the struggle that no one had witnessed. The dogs picked up a scent and began following it, pulling their handlers down Sycamore Lane in the direction the rust-colored pickup truck had gone, though no one knew that yet. The scent trail ended abruptly at the corner where the truck had turned, the dogs circling in confusion before their handlers realized what this meant. Lily had gotten into a vehicle at that point. She hadn't walked away or been carried into the woods. She had been taken in a car or truck, which meant she could be anywhere by now. The implications were sobering, and when the handlers reported back to Sergeant Holloway, she immediately contacted state police and asked them to issue an alert to law enforcement agencies throughout Oregon and into neighboring states as well. Detective Richard Chen arrived from the county sheriff's office to take over the investigation. Chen was in his mid-30s, had been a detective for 7 years, and had worked several missing person cases before, though never one involving a child taken from their own neighborhood. He set up his workspace in the Carter's dining room, spreading files and photographs and maps across the table that Sarah had carefully polished just 2 days earlier in preparation for a family dinner that now seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. Detective Chen began the painstaking process of building a timeline. He interviewed Sarah and Thomas separately, asking them to recount every detail of the morning from the moment they woke up to the moment they realized Lily was missing. He asked about routines and variations. From those routines, about anyone who might have known that Lily would be at the bus stop at that specific time, about anyone who had shown unusual interest in Lily or in the Carter family. He interviewed Michael, Lily's brother, who was devastated by his sister's disappearance and blamed himself for not walking with her to the bus stop, even though their stops were in different directions, and it had never occurred to him that she might need protection. Michael told Detective Chen about Lily's friends, about her daily routine, about the games she liked to play and the places she liked to go. He mentioned that Lily sometimes went to the park after school with their mother, and that she had taken swimming lessons at the community pool last summer, and that she was afraid of dogs, but loved cats. Detective Chen interviewed the bus driver, Margaret Reynolds, who described finding the scattered lunch and immediately sensing that something was wrong. He interviewed every neighbor on Sycamore Lane and on the surrounding streets, asking what they had seen or heard that morning, whether they had noticed any unfamiliar vehicles in the area, whether there had been any strangers asking questions, or anyone who seemed out of place. Most people had nothing useful to report, had seen nothing unusual, had been going about their morning routines without noticing the tragedy unfolding just outside their windows. But Mrs. Patterson, who had been watering her flowers across the street from the Carter's house, mentioned something that made Detective Chen pause in his note-taking. She said there had been a rust-colored pickup truck that passed by while she was outside, moving slowly like the driver was looking for an address. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, because unfamiliar vehicles came through the neighborhood occasionally, delivery trucks and contractors and people visiting relatives. But thinking about it now, the truck had seemed to slow even more as it approached the bus stop, and she couldn't remember seeing it come back in the other direction, which meant it had probably turned off onto one of the side streets. Detective Chen asked Mrs. Patterson to describe the truck in as much detail as she could remember. She said it was old, maybe from the 80s, with faded paint and visible rust spots. She couldn't remember the license plate number or even what state it was from, hadn't been paying that much attention. But she thought the truck might have been a Ford or a Chevy, something American-made rather than one of the Japanese trucks that were becoming more popular. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something, a potential lead in a case that so far had provided very few. The media descended on Maple Ridge by late afternoon. Television news vans with satellite dishes on top parked along Sycamore Lane, and reporters stood in front of the Carter house doing live shots for the evening news. The story had everything that made for compelling television. And Weinzhou, innocent child, a safe neighborhood shattered, grieving parents, and a community in shock. The images being broadcast showed search teams combing through woods, police officers interviewing residents, and Sarah Carter's tear-stained face as she begged whoever had taken her daughter to please bring her home safely. A press conference was held at the Maple Ridge Police Department at 5 o'clock that evening. Chief of Police Robert Daniels stood at a podium, flanked by Sergeant Holloway, Detective Chen, and representatives from the state police and FBI, who had been called in because child abductions were federal crimes if they crossed state lines. Chief Daniels read a prepared statement describing Lily's disappearance and asking anyone with information to contact the police immediately. He provided a physical description of Lily and listed what she had been wearing when she disappeared. Sarah and Thomas Carter stood off to the side during the press conference, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. When Chief Daniels finished his statement, Sarah stepped forward to address the cameras directly. Her voice was shaking but determined as she spoke to whoever had taken her daughter. She said that Lily was a sweet, innocent child who must be frightened and confused. She begged the person who took her to please let her go, to drop her off somewhere safe where she could be found. She promised there would be no questions asked, no legal repercussions if Lily was returned unharmed. All they wanted was their daughter back. The plea was broadcast on every television station in Oregon that evening and was picked up by national news networks as well. Images of Lily's face, a school photograph showing her gap-toothed smile and bright blue eyes, were shown repeatedly. The tip line that had been set up at the police department began receiving calls, though most were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful suggestions from people who thought they might have seen something or who had theories about what might have happened. Night fell on Maple Ridge, but the search continued under portable lights that had been brought in to illuminate the woods and fields surrounding the town. Volunteers worked in shifts, some going home to rest while others arrived to take their places. The community center remained open all night, serving as a hub where searchers could get coffee and sandwiches and brief respites from the emotional toll of looking for a missing child. Prayer vigils were held at several churches, with congregations gathering to pray for Lily's safe return and to support the Carter family in their darkest hour. In the Carter house, Sarah and Thomas sat in their living room surrounded by police officers and equipment and the trappings of an investigation that had taken over their home. They couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely think about anything except where their daughter might be and whether she was safe and scared and crying for them. Michael sat with them, uncharacteristically quiet, his usual teenage bravado completely absent in the face of this crisis that had shattered their family. Detective Chen worked through the night, reviewing every piece of information that had been collected so far, looking for patterns or connections that might point him in the right direction. He had a board set up with photographs and notes and lines connecting different pieces of information, trying to build a picture of what had happened and who might be responsible. The rust-colored pickup truck that Mrs. Patterson had mentioned was a potentially important clue, and he had officers checking with the Department of Motor Vehicles to get a list of all registered pickup trucks matching that description in Oregon and neighboring states. By the second day of the search, the investigation had expanded to include everyone who had any connection to the Carter family or to Lily. Teachers from Maple Ridge Elementary School were interviewed about Lily's behavior and friendships, and whether there had been any incidents that might be relevant. Friends' parents were questioned about whether they had noticed anyone showing unusual interest in Lily. Even family members, despite the obvious anguish this caused Sarah and Thomas, had to be investigated and eliminated as potential suspects because statistics showed that most child abductions were committed by people known to the family. One person who drew particular attention from Detective Chen was Ernest Hoffman, a reclusive mechanic who lived in a small house near the bus stop where Lily had disappeared. Hoffman was in his late 50s, lived alone, and kept to himself in a way that his neighbors found unusual. His yard was overgrown, and his house needed repairs that he never seemed to get around to making. He worked out of a garage behind his house, fixing cars for cash and generally avoiding social interactions whenever possible. Detective Chen interviewed Hoffman at his home, noting the cluttered garage filled with car parts and tools and the general air of neglect that hung over the property. Hoffman seemed nervous during the interview, his answers short and defensive, his body language suggesting someone who had something to hide. He claimed he had been working in his garage the morning Lily disappeared and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. But his garage faced away from the street, and from where he said he had been working, he wouldn't have been able to see the bus stop anyway. Chen asked Hoffman if he minded if officers searched his property, and Hoffman reluctantly agreed, though Chen could see the calculation going on behind his eyes, the weighing of how refusing would look versus what might be found if he allowed the search. Officers spent hours going through Hoffman's house and garage, looking for any evidence that Lily had been there, but they found nothing. No children's clothing, no signs of a struggle, nothing that would indicate Hoffman had been involved in Lily's disappearance. Still, Chen made a note to keep an eye on Hoffman, to check his background and see if there was any history that might make him a viable suspect. Another person of interest was Victor Ramirez, an ice cream truck driver who operated in Maple Ridge during the summer months. Ramirez was in his 40s, had driven the ice cream truck for 3 years, and was generally well-liked by the children who flocked to his truck when they heard its distinctive music playing through neighborhood streets. But when Detective Chen interviewed him, Ramirez's alibi for the morning of Lily's disappearance was inconsistent. He claimed he had been at his depot preparing his truck for the day's route, but the depot manager said Ramirez hadn't arrived until almost 10 o'clock, more than 2 hours after Lily had vanished. Chen pressed Ramirez about where he had been those 2 hours, and Ramirez became defensive, saying he had been at home and must have misremembered what time he had left. But when Chen checked with Ramirez's neighbors, none of them remembered seeing his distinctive ice cream truck parked in front of his house that morning. The inconsistencies in Ramirez's story made him a strong suspect, and Chen obtained a warrant to search both Ramirez's home and his ice cream truck. The search of Ramirez's property took place on the 3rd day after Lily's disappearance, with forensic teams going through his house and truck looking for any evidence. They found nothing directly related to Lily, but they did find magazines that raised concerns, though the content was not explicitly illegal. Chen brought Ramirez in for formal questioning, pushing him harder on his whereabouts the morning of the abduction, trying to break through the inconsistencies and evasions. But Ramirez stuck to his story, And without physical evidence linking him to Lily's disappearance, Chen couldn't charge him with anything. The investigation was generating hundreds of leads, each one needing to be followed up on, each one potentially the key to finding Lily, or potentially a dead end that wasted valuable time and resources. Tips came in from people who thought they had seen Lily at a gas station, or a rest stop, or walking along a highway. Each tip was investigated, officers dispatched to check out the sighting, but none of them panned out. It wasn't Lily. It was another blonde girl, or the person had been mistaken about what they had seen, or they were simply wrong. The pressure on Detective Chen and the rest of the investigation team was immense. Every day that passed without finding Lily decreased the likelihood that she would be found alive. Statistics about child abductions were grim. If a child wasn't found within the first 72 hours, the chances of a positive outcome dropped dramatically. The entire town was watching, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle but fearing the worst. And Chen knew that if they didn't find Lily soon, if they didn't catch whoever had taken her, he would carry that failure with him for the rest of his career. Media coverage of the case continued to intensify. National news programs picked up the story, and Lily's face became familiar to viewers across the country. The Amber Alert system had been activated, though it was still relatively new and not as widespread as it would become in later years. Sarah and Thomas did multiple interviews, appearing on morning shows and news programs, their desperation and anguish visible to millions of viewers who watched and felt their own hearts break for these parents living every parent's worst nightmare. Psychics and self-proclaimed clairvoyants began contacting the police, offering their services to help find Lily. Detective Chen was skeptical of such offers, but couldn't afford to ignore any potential avenue. He met with several of them, listening to their visions and predictions and supposed insights into where Lily might be. None of it was helpful, and Chen felt the frustration building as days passed without any significant breaks in the case. The physical search of the area around Maple Ridge continued, though it was becoming clear that if Lily was in the woods or fields nearby, she would have been found by now. Hundreds of volunteers had covered every square mile within a 10-mile radius of town, looking under every bush, checking every abandoned building, searching every place a child might be hidden or might have wandered to. The fact that they had found nothing suggested what Detective Chen had suspected from the beginning. Lily had been taken away from Maple Ridge in a vehicle and could be anywhere by now. 2 weeks after Lily's disappearance, the investigation seemed to have stalled. All the obvious leads had been pursued and eliminated. Ernest Hoffman, the reclusive mechanic, had been thoroughly investigated and cleared. Victor Ramirez, the ice cream truck driver with the inconsistent alibi, had eventually been charged with unrelated offenses, but had been ruled out as a suspect in Lily's abduction after further investigation revealed he had been in the neighboring county the morning she disappeared, a fact confirmed by gas station security footage. The rust-colored pickup truck that Mrs. Patterson had seen remained unidentified, despite extensive searches of DMV records and multiple public appeals for information. The case began to receive less media attention as other stories pushed it out of the news cycle. The search efforts were scaled back, with fewer volunteers showing up each day as hope faded and the reality set in that Lily might never be found. Sarah and Thomas Carter continued to plead for information, continued to hold on to hope, but the passage of time was taking its toll. Sarah had stopped sleeping in her own bed, instead lying on Lily's bed surrounded by her daughter's stuffed animals, as if proximity to Lily's things might somehow bring her daughter back. Thomas threw himself into the search, efforts, going out every day with whatever volunteers remained, refusing to give up even as others began to accept that Lily was probably gone forever. Detective Chen refused to let the case go cold, but he was running out of leads to pursue. He reviewed all the evidence multiple times, re-interviewed witnesses, looked for connections he might have missed the first time through. But there was nothing new, no breakthrough that would crack the case open. He knew that without some new piece of information, some witness coming forward with something they had remembered, or some piece of physical evidence being discovered, the case would remain unsolved. The town of Maple Ridge changed in the weeks following Lily's disappearance. Parents no longer let their children walk to bus stops alone. Doors that had once been left unlocked during the day were now secured. People looked at strangers with suspicion, rather than the friendly curiosity that had once characterized the community. The sense of safety and security that had defined life in Maple Ridge was gone, replaced by fear and wariness, and the knowledge that terrible things could happen anywhere, even in small towns where everyone knew everyone. Summer turned to fall, and the leaves on the trees began changing colors. Michael went back to school, though he struggled to concentrate and his grades suffered. Sarah and Thomas tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, but everything felt hollow and meaningless without Lily. They went through the motions of daily existence, but they were really just waiting, hoping, praying that somehow their daughter would be found. The case officially went cold in late September. Detective Chen was assigned to other investigations, though he continued to think about Lily Carter and her family, continued to wonder what he might have missed, what clue might have been there that he failed to see. The file remained open, and Chen checked it periodically for any new information, but the leads had all been exhausted, and there was nothing left to pursue. Then, in early January of 1997, something remarkable happened. A new detective, Catherine Walsh, was assigned to the cold case unit of the county sheriff's office. Walsh was young but ambitious, with a reputation for being thorough and persistent. As part of her orientation to the unit, she was given several cold cases to review, and one of them was the Lily Carter abduction. Walsh spent days reading through the file, familiarizing herself with every detail of the case. She read all the witness statements, studied all the evidence reports, looked at all the photographs that had been taken during the investigation. And as she read, something caught her attention, a small detail that seemed to have been overlooked or dismissed as unimportant during the initial investigation. Several witnesses had mentioned seeing a rust-colored pickup truck in the neighborhood the morning of Lily's disappearance. Miss Oshomai, Patterson had seen it on Sycamore Lane, moving slowly past the Carter house. Another witness, a jogger who had been running through the neighborhood, had mentioned seeing a similar truck parked near the edge of town about 20 minutes before Lily disappeared. At the time, investigators had tried to identify the truck, but had been unable to find a match in DMV records for any residents of Maple Ridge or the surrounding area. But Walsh noticed something that Detective Chen apparently hadn't considered fully. The witness statements all described the truck as rust-colored, but they had assumed this meant the paint was rusty or faded. Walsh wondered if the truck had actually been painted rust color, a brownish-orange shade that was popular on pickup trucks in the 1970s and 80s. If that was the case, the search parameters used for DMV records might have been too narrow. Walsh expanded the search to include trucks registered in that specific color, cross-referencing them with any connections to Maple Ridge or to people who might have known the Carter family. It was tedious work, going through hundreds of vehicle registrations, but Walsh was methodical and patient. And after 3 days of searching, she found something interesting. There was a rust-colored 1983 Chevrolet pickup truck registered to a man named Gary Motes. The name didn't immediately ring any bells, but Walsh dug deeper. Gary Motes was 42 years old, had lived in Maple Ridge for 2 years, and had moved to Idaho in late June of 1996, just days after Lily Carter's disappearance. The timing was suspicious, and Walsh felt the first stirrings of excitement that came with potentially breaking a cold case. She dug even deeper into Motes's background and found the connection that made everything click into place. Gary Motes was the uncle of Jennifer Wilkins, who had been Lily Carter's babysitter 2 years earlier. Jennifer had watched Lily and Michael after school, while Sarah worked part-time at the library. Jennifer had stopped babysitting when she graduated from high school and left for college. But during the time she had worked for the Carters, her uncle Gary had occasionally picked her up from the Carter house. This meant Gary Moats had been to the Carter house, had known the family's routine, had possibly even interacted with Lily. And he owned a rust-colored pickup truck and had left town just days after Lily disappeared. Walsh felt her pulse quicken as she realized she might have found the break the case needed. She presented her findings to her supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Stevens, who agreed that this warranted further investigation. Walsh contacted the Idaho State Police and requested assistance in locating Gary Moats. Records showed he was living in Coeur d'Alene, a city in northern Idaho near the Washington border. Idaho police agreed to conduct surveillance on Moats, while Walsh obtained warrants to search his property and question him about Lily's disappearance. The Idaho State Police set up surveillance on Moats's residence, a small house on the outskirts of Coeur d'Alene. They observed him for several days, documenting his movements and activities. Moats worked as a handyman, taking odd jobs around the area, and seemed to live alone. His rust-colored pickup truck was parked in the driveway, the same truck that matched the descriptions given by witnesses in Maple Ridge. Walsh flew to Idaho along with Detective Chen, who had been thrilled to hear about the potential break in the case he had worked so hard on months earlier. They coordinated with Idaho State Police to conduct a search of Moats's property and to bring him in for questioning. The operation was planned carefully, with officers positioning themselves around the property before dawn on January 23, 1997. At 6 a.m, officers knocked on Moats's door. He answered looking bleary and confused, clearly having just woken up. When officers identified themselves and informed him they had a warrant to search his property, Moats's demeanor changed. He became defensive and agitated, asking what this was about, insisting they had no right to search his house. But the warrant was valid, and officers entered the residence while Moats was placed in handcuffs and taken to a police car. The search of Moats's house took several hours. Officers went through every room, every closet, every drawer, looking for any evidence that Lily Carter had been there. In the basement, they found children's clothing that didn't match anything Moats would have a legitimate reason to own. Among the clothing was a purple T-shirt with a unicorn on the front. Walsh felt her breath catch when she saw it. According to the case file, that was exactly what Lily had been wearing when she disappeared. But Lily herself was not at the house. Officers searched the entire property, including an old shed in the backyard, but found no sign of the missing girl. Walsh felt a mixture of triumph at having found evidence linking Moats to the crime and frustration at not finding Lily herself. Where was she? What had Moats done with her? At the police station, Detective Chen and Detective Walsh prepared to interrogate Gary Moats. They had the physical evidence from his house, including the purple unicorn T-shirt, and they had the circumstantial evidence of his connection to the Carter family and his suspicious departure from Maple Ridge. They began the interrogation with the standard warnings, informing Moats of his rights and offering him the opportunity to have a lawyer present. Moats waived his right to an attorney, saying he had nothing to hide. But as the interrogation began and the detectives laid out the evidence they had found, his confidence began to crack. Chen showed him photographs of the purple T-shirt found in his basement and asked him to explain how it had gotten there. Moats claimed he didn't know what they were talking about, that the shirt must have been left by a friend's child who had visited, though he couldn't provide any names or details. Walsh pressed harder, describing the morning of June 17th when Lily Carter had disappeared. She laid out the timeline, the witness descriptions of the rust-colored pickup truck, Moats's connection to the Carter family through his niece. She pointed out that he had left Oregon just days after Lily's disappearance, moving to Idaho without explanation. Moats insisted it was all a coincidence, that he had moved to Idaho for a job opportunity, that he barely remembered the Carter family or his niece's babysitting job. But Chen and Walsh kept pushing, taking turns questioning him, pointing out inconsistencies in his story, showing him evidence that contradicted his claims. The interrogation went on for hours, with Moats growing increasingly agitated and defensive. Finally, after 6 hours of questioning, something in him seemed to break. He asked for a moment alone, and when the detectives returned, he said he wanted to make a deal. Moats said he would tell them what happened to Lily, but only if they would agree to certain terms. He wanted a reduced sentence, wanted certain charges dropped, wanted guarantees about where he would be imprisoned. Chen and Walsh exchanged glances, knowing they couldn't make those kinds of promises without consulting with prosecutors, but also knowing that if Moats had information about Lily's whereabouts, they needed to hear it. They brought in a prosecutor from the local district attorney's office, who worked out a preliminary agreement with Moats's court-appointed attorney, who had been called in when it became clear that Moats wanted to confess. The agreement specified that Moats would receive a reduced sentence in exchange for truthful information about what had happened to Lily Carter and where she could be found. If his information proved false or misleading, the agreement would be void. With the agreement in place, Gary Moats began to talk. He admitted that he had taken Lily Carter from the bus stop on June 17th. He said he had been driving through the neighborhood that morning, had seen her standing alone at the bus stop, and had acted on impulse. He claimed he hadn't planned it, that it just happened, though the detectives were skeptical of this claim, given that he had apparently gone to the bus stop knowing Lily would be there. Moats described pulling up in his truck and asking Lily for directions, then grabbing her and pulling her into the vehicle when she came close enough. He admitted he had been frightened by what he had done, had driven out of town not knowing what to do next. He said he had kept Lily in his house in Maple Ridge for 2 days, during which time the massive search was underway and police were interviewing residents throughout the area. Realizing he needed to leave town, Moats said he had contacted an acquaintance in Idaho, a man named Darren Peterson, who owed him money and favors from some unspecified past dealings. Moats said he had told Peterson he needed a place to stay for a while, and also needed someone to look after a kid who was in his custody. He claimed he told Peterson that Lily was his niece, and that he was in the middle of a custody dispute with the girl's mother. According to Moats, Peterson had agreed to take Lily in at his remote property outside Coeur d'Alene. Moats said he had driven to Idaho with Lily in his truck, keeping her drugged and hidden under a blanket in case they were stopped. He had dropped Lily off at Peterson's property, and then moved into town, visiting Peterson occasionally to check on the girl, but otherwise trying to start a new life and put distance between himself and his crime. The most remarkable part of Moats's confession was his claim that Lily was still alive. He said that as far as he knew, she was still at Peterson's property, being kept there under the false belief that this was a custody situation and that eventually Moats would work things out with Lily's supposed mother and come get her. Walsh and Chen were stunned by this information. They had assumed, as had everyone involved in the case, that Lily was likely dead. The possibility that she was alive after more than 7 months was almost too much to hope for. But they couldn't waste time on hope or disbelief. If there was any chance Lily was alive, they needed to act immediately. Moats provided the address of Darren Peterson's property, a remote location about 20 miles outside Coeur d'Alene. Police immediately began coordinating a rescue operation, working with Idaho State Police, the FBI, and local law enforcement to plan an approach to the property that would maximize the chances of recovering Lily safely while minimizing the risk of Peterson fleeing or harming her if he realized police were coming. The operation was planned for the following morning, January 24th. Officers would approach the property at dawn before Peterson was likely to be fully awake, and would move quickly to secure the house and any outbuildings. Hostage negotiators were put on standby in case Peterson barricaded himself with Lily, and medical personnel were positioned nearby in case Lily needed immediate medical attention. Detective Walsh called Sarah and Thomas Carter to inform them of the developments. She was careful not to give them false hope, emphasizing that they didn't know for certain that Lily was at the property or what condition she might be in if she was there. But after more than 7 months of having no idea what had happened to their daughter, this news, however tentative, was the first real hope the Carters had experienced. Sarah collapsed into Thomas's arms, both of them crying with a mixture of hope and fear, and barely dared to believe possibility. At dawn on January 24th, the rescue operation began. Multiple police vehicles approached Darren Peterson's property from different directions, moving as quietly as possible given the remote location. The property consisted of a dilapidated house, a barn that looked like it might collapse at any moment, and several other outbuildings scattered across 5 acres of heavily wooded land. Smoke rose from the house's chimney, suggesting someone was home. Officers surrounded the property and then moved in quickly, with several teams approaching the house from different angles. They announced their presence and ordered anyone inside to come out with their hands visible. For a long moment there was no response, and officers prepared to force entry. Then the front door opened, and a man emerged looking confused and frightened. It was Darren Peterson, and officers immediately moved to secure him, placing him in handcuffs and moving him away from the house. Other officers entered the house, moving through rooms with weapons drawn, calling out for Lily Carter. The house was cluttered and dirty, with trash and empty beer cans scattered everywhere. The search seemed to take forever, though it was actually only minutes. And then, from a back bedroom, an officer called out that he had found her. Lily was sitting on a bed in a small room that smelled of mildew and neglect. She was wearing clothes that were too large for her and looked like they might have come from a thrift store. Her blonde hair was longer than it had been in June, and it was tangled and unwashed. She looked thinner, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But she was alive. After 226 days, Lily Carter was alive. The officer who found her approached slowly, speaking in a gentle voice, telling Lily that she was safe now, that they were there to take her home to her mommy and daddy. Lily looked at him with confusion and fear, not understanding who these people were or what was happening. She had been told by Peterson that her Uncle Gary was working things out with her mother and that she would go home soon, but soon had turned into months, and she had begun to believe she would never see her parents again. Medical personnel were brought in to examine Lily. She was physically unharmed, though clearly malnourished and showing signs of emotional trauma. She was frightened and confused, asking for Gary, asking when she could go home, not understanding that these police officers were the ones taking her home. Psychologists were called in to help manage the situation, to explain to Lily in age-appropriate terms what had happened and where she was going now. Detective Walsh called the Carters with the news that Lily had been found alive. Sarah's scream of joy could be heard throughout the police station, and Thomas was sobbing too hard to speak. They were told that Lily was being taken to a hospital in Coeur d'Alene for evaluation, and that they should come immediately. Within an hour, Sarah and Thomas were on a plane to Idaho, accompanied by Michael, who had refused to stay behind when they told him his sister had been found. The Foxborough reunion took place at the hospital later that day. Lily was in a private room, cleaned up and wearing a hospital gown, looking small and fragile in the big hospital bed. When Sarah and Thomas entered the room, Lily looked up, and for a moment there was no recognition. 7 months was a long time in a 7-year-old's life, and she had been through trauma that had affected her memory and perception. But then something clicked, and she whispered, "Mommy." And Sarah rushed forward, wrapping her daughter in her arms and sobbing into her hair. Thomas joined them, and the three of them held each other, crying and laughing and just being together again after so long. Michael stood in the doorway, tears streaming down his face, waiting his turn to hug his sister. When Lily finally noticed him and called his name, he came forward and gently hugged her, telling her how much he had missed her and how glad he was that she was okay. The hospital staff gave the family privacy, though psychologists monitored the reunion to ensure it wasn't too overwhelming for Lily. She was confused about many things, asking questions about why she hadn't been able to come home, where they had been all this time, whether they were really there or if she was dreaming. Sarah and Thomas tried to answer her questions as simply and honestly as they could, though they were careful not to say anything that might traumatize her further. Lily spent 3 days in the hospital undergoing medical and psychological evaluations. Physically, aside from being underweight and having some dental issues from poor nutrition and hygiene, she was healthy. Psychologically, the trauma of her abduction and prolonged captivity would require extensive therapy. But doctors were optimistic about her recovery, given her young age, and the fact that she had not been physically or sexually abused during her captivity. The news of Lily's rescue spread quickly, making national headlines. The story that had captivated the country the previous summer now had the rare happy ending that everyone had hoped for, but few had believed would happen. News crews descended on Coeur d'Alene, and Sarah and Thomas gave a brief statement thanking everyone who had helped search for Lily and expressing their gratitude to Detective Walsh for her persistence in reviewing the cold case and finding the lead that broke it open. Back in Maple Ridge, the town erupted in celebration. Yellow ribbons that had been tied to trees throughout the community the previous summer, symbols of hope for Lily's return, were joined by balloons and signs welcoming her home. The community center organized a welcome home party for whenever the Carters returned to Oregon. People who had searched for Lily, who had prayed for her, who had held on to hope even when it seemed hopeless, felt a collective sense of relief and joy. Gary Moats was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple other crimes. Despite the deal that had been struck for his confession, prosecutors made it clear they would seek the maximum penalty within the parameters of the agreement. Moats would eventually be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, spending the rest of his days behind bars for what he had done to Lily and her family. Darren Peterson was also charged as an accomplice, though his sentence would be lighter given that he claimed he had believed Moats's story about a custody dispute and had thought he was helping a friend. Still, he had kept a child who was clearly distressed and had not questioned the situation sufficiently or contacted authorities when things didn't add up. He would serve 10 years in prison for his role in Lily's prolonged captivity. The Carter family returned to Maple Ridge a week after Lily's rescue. They landed at the local airport to find hundreds of people waiting to welcome them home. There was cheering and crying and hugging, and Lily was overwhelmed by all the attention from people she didn't remember or recognize. Sarah and Thomas shielded her as best they could, getting her into their car and driving home to the house on Sycamore Lane that had felt so empty for more than 7 months. Life didn't immediately return to normal. How could it? Lily had missed 7 months of school, 7 months of growing up with her family, 7 months of the childhood that had been stolen from her by Gary Moats. She had nightmares and separation anxiety, becoming panicked if her parents were out of her sight for more than a few minutes. She flinched at unexpected sounds and movements, and she was afraid of men with beards or baseball caps, both of which reminded her of her captor. But with time and therapy and the support of her family and community, Lily began to heal. She returned to school gradually, starting with just a few hours a day and building up to full days as she became more comfortable. Her classmates had been educated by teachers and counselors about what had happened and how to welcome Lily back without overwhelming her. Tommy Henderson, her best friend, stayed by her side those first difficult weeks, sharing his lunch cookies with her just like he always had. The bus stop where Lily had been taken was no longer used. Parents in the neighborhood had petitioned the school district to move the stop to a more visible location and to implement new safety protocols. Children no longer waited at bus stops alone, and parents now took turns supervising the stops, ensuring that what happened to Lily could never happen to another child in Maple Ridge. The town installed a memorial at the community center, not as a reminder of tragedy but as a celebration of resilience and hope, and the power of a community that refused to give up. It included a plaque with Lily's name and the dates of her disappearance and rescue, along with words thanking everyone who had helped search for her and worked to bring her home. Detective Catherine Walsh received commendations for her work on the case, and her thorough review of the cold case file that had led to Gary Moats became an example used in law enforcement training programs. Detective Richard Chen, while relieved and thrilled that Lily had been found, carried some guilt that he hadn't made the connection during his initial investigation. But Walsh was quick to credit him with doing excellent investigative work under extremely difficult circumstances, and noted that cold cases often benefited from fresh eyes and distance from the emotional intensity of the immediate investigation. The Carters did extensive interviews about their experience, hoping that sharing their story might help other families dealing with missing children. Sarah became an advocate for child safety, speaking at schools and community events about the importance of teaching children about potential dangers while not frightening them unnecessarily. Thomas worked with the Maple Ridge Police Department to implement new programs for responding to child abductions, ensuring that the lessons learned from Lily's case would improve outcomes for future cases. Michael, who had struggled with guilt over not protecting his sister, eventually came to terms with what had happened through therapy and family support. He became protective of Lily in a way he had never been before, walking her to school every day, even though it meant leaving for his own school earlier than necessary. The siblings developed a closer relationship than they had before, the trauma they had shared creating a bond that would last their entire lives. Lily herself grew up bearing the scars of what had happened to her, but also displaying a remarkable resilience. She loved dolphins, perhaps because they reminded her of the library book she had been carrying the day she was taken, the book about dolphins that had been in her backpack when it was found in the Mercer's yard. She wanted to be a marine biologist when she grew up, studying the creatures that swam free in the ocean, unconfined and unrestricted in ways that she understood on a visceral level. The case of Lily Carter's abduction and miraculous rescue became one of those rare stories that captured the public imagination not because of its tragedy, but because of its triumph. In a world where missing children cases so often ended badly, where families were left with questions that would never be answered and grief that would never be fully resolved, Lily's story offered hope. It demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation, the value of never giving up on cold cases, and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, miracles could happen. Years later, Sarah Carter would say that the worst and best days of her life were separated by 226 days, but connected by an unbreakable thread of hope. The worst day was June 17th, 1996, when her daughter walked out the front door and didn't come home. The best day was January 24th, 1997, when Lily was found alive and their family was made whole again. Everything in between was darkness, punctuated by the light of a community that refused to stop searching, and a detective who refused to accept that the case was unsolvable. The story of that last morning on Sycomber Lane, when 7-year-old Lily Carter, in her purple unicorn t-shirt, walked toward the school bus stop and into a nightmare, would be told and retold in Maple Ridge for generations. But it would always end with the same ending, the one that defied expectations and statistics and the grim realities that usually attend such cases. It would end with Lily coming home, with a family reunited, with a town that learned that even in its darkest moments, hope could survive and, sometimes, could even prevail.